The empty field. The harvest was over. The stubble of wheat stood like short, tired bristles across the field, and the ground smelled faintly of earth resting after hard work. The granaries were filled. The tools were stored away, and the farmer's days had grown quieter, lighter almost. And yet, at the far edge of the field, one figure remained: the Scarecrow. It stood where it had been all summer, shoulders wide, arms stretched, wearing the same patched shirt that flapped in the breeze. A straw hat, half collapsed on one side, still sat crooked on its head. It was meant to frighten birds, but now, with no crop to guard, it looked oddly solemn, as though it had chosen to stay behind, keeping watch over nothing at all. The farmer noticed it that morning when he went to the edge of the field. He carried no tools, only his walking stick. He paused and squinted. He murmured to himself. I never took you down. It wasn't forgetfulness, not exactly. More a kind of neglect, mixed with curiosity. Perhaps he wanted to see how long it would stand. Perhaps he liked the company. The Scarecrow did not answer, of course, but it seemed to lean slightly toward him as if listening. Its shadow stretched long in the low autumn light, reaching almost to the farmer's boots. For a while the two of them stood there, the man and the Scarecrow, one made of flesh, the other of sticks and straw, both keeping company with the silence of an empty field. The farmer gave a small nod, the kind reserved for old neighbors or loyal dogs. Stay then, he said softly. Stay as long as you wish. And with that he turned back toward his cottage, leaving the Scarecrow alone, once more alone, but somehow not forgotten. The quiet guardian. The days shortened. Frost began to lace the edges of the grass each morning, and the crows, no longer threatened by harvest, gathered in dark flocks that wheeled across the pale sky. They landed boldly on fence posts and trees, their cries carrying through the crisp air. And yet, even with the grain long gone, the Scarecrow remained at its post. Its shirt grew stiffer in the cold, its straw hair poked unevenly from under the tilted hat, and still it stood, arms stretched wide, as though holding back the empty sky. The farmer found himself watching it more often now. When he fed the hens, when he drew water from the well, his eyes drifted toward that solitary figure in the field. It was not frightening to the birds anymore. They perched on its shoulders, hopped along its wooden arms, even tugged at the loose straw. Still there was a dignity about it, a stubbornness. Guardian of nothing, the farmer chuckled one afternoon, leaning on his walking stick, and yet still a guardian. The thought settled in him like a warm coal. For though the field lay bare, the Scarecrow seemed to be protecting something invisible, the memory of the harvest, perhaps, or the promise of next year's seed. Sometimes at dusk, when the fog rolled low and the air grew very still, the farmer imagined the Scarecrow breathing, not with lungs, but with patience, a slow, quiet kind of presence that filled the empty land with watchfulness. And though he knew it was only cloth straw and sticks, the farmer began to greet it each morning as if acknowledging a silent companion. Keep watch, he would say, half to himself, half to the Scarecrow. I'll be back before dark. The Scarecrow did not move, but its shadow stretched faithfully at his side until the sun climbed high enough to erase it. Winter settles in snow arrived quietly, as though the sky itself had grown weary and decided to lie down upon the earth. It came first in flurries drifting like scattered feathers, then in steady sheets that softened the edges of fence posts and blanketed the empty field. The Scarecrow, too, was dressed anew. Its hat wore a mound of snow like a crown, its shoulders padded with white, its arms holding the weight without complaint. The crows had gone south, leaving the figure alone in a world muffled by silence. The farmer trudged through the snow each morning to check on his hens, his boots crunching with each step. And always across the field he saw the Scarecrow, unmoving, unchanging, the only upright thing left in a season of stillness. One evening, as the sun dipped early and the air carried the bite of frost, the farmer paused at the gate and watched. There was something strangely comforting about that lonely figure standing guard over an empty sleeping field. It looks colder than I feel, he muttered, pulling his scarf tighter. Then he laughed softly at himself. The Scarecrow seemed not only to endure winter, but to embody it, a figure stitched together from remnants enduring the long night without food, without fire, without complaint. The farmer, on nights when the wind howled at the shutters, thought of the Scarecrow, and the thought warmed him. If it can stand there without grumbling, he told himself, then I can stand another winter's night. In its silence, the Scarecrow had become his quiet teacher, and so the season passed, snow upon snow, while the Scarecrow stood a sentinel, not of crops, but of patience. Whispers of spring. The snow did not vanish all at once. It retreated slowly by like a shy guest, slipping away from a gathering. Patches of brown earth appeared here and there, soft and damp, until the field began to breathe again. The Scarecrow weathered and faded, emerged from its winter armor of ice and frost. Its coat sagged, its straw hands poked out unevenly, but it still stood stubborn and quiet. One afternoon, when the air smelled faintly of thawed soil and the first birds returned to the hedges, children from the village came running. Their boots splashed through puddles, their laughter startled the stillness. At the far edge of the field, they spotted the Scarecrow. Look at him, cried one. He must have been here all winter, said another wide-eyed. Do you think he gets lonely? Whispered a smaller child. Half serious, the braver ones approached. They circled the figure, poked gently at its straw-stuffed arms, and giggled when the wind rattled its hat. To them it was not just a bundle of sticks and cloth, but something more, half guardian, half mystery. By evening they were calling it names. Captain Strawcoat, the tall watcher, old Mr. Sleepy. They gave it stories, too, saying it had seen snowstorms wrestle in the sky, had spoken with owls at midnight, and had guarded the sleeping earth until spring's return. The farmer watching from his gate smiled. He had once thought of the Scarecrow as a tool, nothing more. Now it seemed to have slipped gently into the village's imagination, as if it had grown roots, not in the soil, but in people's minds. And so while the earth stirred beneath melting snow, the Scarecrow's second life began not only as a sentinel of fields, but as a figure of play and story. The Summer of Stories. By the time spring ripened into summer, the Scarecrow was no longer just a silent figure at the edge of the field. It had become the center of a small, invisible kingdom, a kingdom ruled by children's laughter. Every afternoon, when the chores were done and the sun slanted low, the children came running. They brought sticks for swords, flowers for crowns, and scraps of cloth to tie around the Scarecrow's arms like banners. To them, it was never only straw and rags. One day, it was a knight guarding the gates of a hidden castle. Another day, it was a pirate marooned on a lonely island. Sometimes it was simply old Strawface, who listened patiently to secrets whispered between giggles. The Scarecrow, of course, never moved. It did not smile or frown, but the children seemed certain it listened. When they shouted their battles and sang their songs, it stood tall, as if keeping watch over their imaginations. The farmer noticed the visits. At first he worried the children might trample the tender shoots, but soon he let them be. Their games, he thought, were as much a part of the field's growth as the wheat itself. And perhaps, though he never admitted it aloud, he liked the way the Scarecrow seemed less lonely with company. As summer deepened, so too did the stories. Some children began to say the Scarecrow had magic, that its button eyes saw more than people thought, that at night it stepped quietly across the fields to chase away mischief. The Scarecrow, swaying slightly in the warm evening breeze, kept its silence, yet somehow silence only added to its legend. The harvest moon. By the time the first chill crept into the evenings, the fields had turned gold. Stalks bowed under the weight of ripened grain, and the air carried the smell of straw earth and smoke from the first hearth fires of the season. The Scarecrow still stood at its post arms outstretched, as though presenting the harvest to the ski. Its coat was faded, its hat more crooked than before, but in the eyes of the villagers it had become something more than old clothes on a stick. On the night of the harvest moon, the villagers gathered to give thanks. Lanterns were strung along fences, children chased each other with bundles of wheat, and songs rose into the night air. And though no one said it directly, many eyes turned toward the Scarecrow standing quietly at the field's edge. "It has kept watch," someone whispered. "It has guarded the grain," said another. And "Listen to the children," laughed a third. Before long, the Scarecrow was no longer just an object in the field. It had become a kind of silent guest at the celebration. Some villagers even tied ribbons to its arms as offerings, red and gold fluttering against the darkening sky. The farmer stood nearby, hands folded, watching. He knew the Scarecrow had not truly fought off crows or storms, and yet in some mysterious way it had done its work. It had kept the field from feeling empty. It had given the people a figure to lean their gratitude upon. The moon rose high and round, painting the Scarecrow in silver light. For a moment it looked almost alive, standing tall against the horizon. The villagers fell into a hush, as if some unseen spirit had passed among them. The Scarecrow said nothing, but in its silence the people heard enough. The winter's wear. The autumn songs faded with the falling leaves, and soon the winds sharpened their voices. Frost began to rim the edges of the fields, and the Scarecrow once again found itself clothed not only in rags and straw, but in ice and snow. Its hat sagged under white weight, its coat stiffened with frost, yet still it stood. The children no longer played near it, for their games had turned to sleds and fireside laughter. The villagers hurried past with cloaks drawn tight, but often their eyes would stray toward the field's edge. The Scarecrow was still there, unchanged and uncomplaining, a quiet reminder of steadiness. The farmer, trudging out each morning with pail in hand, would stop for a moment, lift his chin toward the Scarecrow, and nod. It had become a habit now, like greeting a neighbor who never spoke but always listened. Storms came covering the land in white drifts. Sometimes the Scarecrow seemed almost buried, only its crooked hat poking through the snow. And yet, when the winds calmed and the sun returned, there it was, leaning, yes, but upright, as though it had chosen to remain. There was a strange comfort in its persistence. The Scarecrow had no need of fire, no craving for bread, no longing for shelter. It endured season after season without complaint. In its silence, it seemed to whisper a lesson the villagers carried quietly in their own hearts, that not all strength roars and not all guardians move. One evening, under a pale winter moon, the farmer lingered by the Scarecrow longer than usual. The world was hushed as if wrapped in cotton. He placed a hand on the frozen wood of its frame. "Stay with me," he murmured. The Scarecrow did not answer, but it stayed, and in that stillness both man and field felt a little less alone. Children of spring, the snows loosened their grip at last, dripping from rooftops and running in cheerful rivulets along the furrows of the fields. Earth softened, and the first green shoots nosed their way through the damp soil. The Scarecrow emerged slowly from its icy casing. Its straw hair stuck out at odd angles, damp but defiant. Its coat tattered further by wind, and frost fluttered weakly in the warmer breeze. It looked older now, more worn, and yet somehow more alive, as though each season had written a line of memory upon it. With spring came the children again. Their boots splashed through puddles, their laughter rang across the fields, and their eyes, bright with invention, turned once more to the Scarecrow. Some said it had survived the winter because it was enchanted. Others whispered that at night, when the frost still bit, it raised its arms to shield the field from harm. They wrapped flowers around its wrists, stuck feathers in its hat, and pressed little offerings of pebbles and twigs at its feet. Half play, half reverence, the farmer watched from his doorway, shaking his head with a smile. The Scarecrow, which once had been no more than a tool against birds, had grown into something else, a quiet companion to children, a figure of imagination, perhaps even a gentle spirit of the field. One dusk, as the sky turned lavender, a child leaned against its wooden leg and whispered a secret, as though expecting an answer. The scarecrow gave none, but its shadow stretched long and kind across the greening earth. Spring was not only a return of warmth, but a return of story, and at the heart of those stories stood the farmer's forgotten scarecrow, silent, steadfast, and strangely beloved.
Chachan.
The Festival of Fields. Every spring, when the sowing was done and the first green threads of barley showed above the earth, the villagers held their festival of fields. It was not a grand affair, no gilded banners, no royal procession, but it was warm with song bread and laughter stitched together by the rhythms of rural life. This year, however, something new had slipped into the heart of the festival, the scarecrow. It began with the children, of course. They wove garlands of daisies and buttercups, crowning the scarecrow like a kindly king. Someone draped a faded red scarf around its shoulders, another tucked sprigs of herbs into its straw stuffed pockets for luck. Before long, even the adults joined in. The blacksmith hammered a little horseshoe and nailed it to the scarecrow's post for strength. The miller's wife placed a loaf of fresh bread in its wooden hand to bless the harvest. Old Marta, who was half blind but saw the world in ways others could not, murmured a blessing as she tied a ribbon around its arm. Stand tall for us, keeper of the fields. As dusk fell, fiddles and pipes stirred the air. The villagers danced in a wide circle around the scarecrow, their shadows spinning across the young shoots of grain. The scarecrow, stiff and silent as ever, seemed to preside over the merriment. Its empty gaze somehow dignified its crooked arms, oddly welcoming. The farmer watched, leaning on his staff. He had never thought his forgotten scarecrow would become more than a tool, yet now it stood as the quiet heart of the village's hopes and laughter, a figure not just of straw and cloth, but of shared memory. That night, when the fires burned low and the songs gave way to yawns, the scarecrow remained alone in the moonlit field. Garlanded, ribboned, crowned, it stood as both sentinel and symbol, a silent partner in the village's promise to the earth.
Yet.
The storm. The sky darkened in a way that made the hens restless and the dogs whine. By late afternoon, the air was heavy, swollen with the smell of rain and the strange hush that comes before the sky breaks. The farmer, standing at the edge of his fields, saw the scarecrow outlined against the gathering gloom. Crown of wilted daisy scarf tugged by the wind, it looked less like a guardian now and more like a lone soldier awaiting a battle. Then the storm came. Lightning cracked open the heavens, thunder rolled like a cart over cobblestones, and the rain arrived in sheets. Wind lashed across the barley shoots, bending them near flat. Trees creaked, shutters banged, and the whole village seemed to huddle and brace. Out in the field, the scarecrow stood. Its posts swayed under the gusts, straw ripped loose and whirled into the storm, yet still it clung to its form. The scarf flapped wildly, then tore away, vanishing into the night. The bread offering dissolved into soggy crumbs, garlands scattered. The children peeking through windows cried out to see their scarecrow king so battered. It will fall, they said, but somehow it did not. Through the gale, through the downpour, it held its ground. By dawn, the storm had spent its fury. The fields were bruised, puddled, but alive, and there, half leaning, half standing, remained the scarecrow, drenched, ragged, stripped of its finery, yet unfallen. The farmer walked to it in the pale morning light. He touched the sodden cloth, the loosened straw, and nodded. You've done what no man could do, stood all night without complaint. The scarecrow, mute as ever, only leaned slightly in reply. Yet in the farmer's heart and in the eyes of every villager who later came to see, it was no longer merely forgotten, it was tested, and it had endured.
That
The tale that spread word of the Scarecrow's survival traveled faster than the storm clouds had. By the time the sun had dried the puddles in the road, neighbors were already stopping by the farmer's fence to shake their heads in wonder. "It should have been torn apart," said one. "No cloth can stand against such wind," said another. Children, bright-eyed and eager, told the story. With wild flourishes, lightning struck right beside it but did not burn it. The wind tried to steal it away, but the Scarecrow planted invisible roots. Each telling grew a little taller, a little braver. Soon the Scarecrow was no longer just the farmer's tool, it became the village's survivor. The baker claimed the bread he had given it had made the Scarecrow strong. The old woman insisted her garland had protected it from harm. Children argued over whose whispered wish had made it stand firm through the storm. Each villager saw a piece of themselves in the tattered figure, as if its endurance had been borrowed from their hopes. The farmer, quiet and amused, listened to these stories, spread like warm smoke. He did not correct them, for he too, standing alone at dawn, had felt something more than wood and straw enduring in that field. Even travelers along the road began to hear of it. They would pause to point and ask, "Is that the Scarecrow that braved the storm?" And the villagers would smile with pride as if the patched figure were one of their own kin. By the next market day, the Scarecrow had become a tale, less an object, more a symbol, a reminder that even the humblest thing left to the mercy of wind and rain might reveal a quiet strength none expected. The Scarecrow, leaning on its weathered post, gave no answer to the chatter, yet in its silence the village heard a story all the same. The fall. The seasons circled again, as they always did. The fields ripened, the fields emptied, and still the Scarecrow stood. But nothing lasts forever, not even straw and string. It began with a slow lean. The post sank a little deeper after the rains. One arm dipped as the knots loosened. Then one windy night, with a sigh that no one heard, the Scarecrow gave way and toppled gently into the stubbled earth. When the farmer found it at dawn, he stood for a long time without moving. It was not shock, nor even sadness. It was the kind of quiet acceptance one feels when an old friend has finished their task. The children, however, gasped when they saw. "It has fallen," they cried, rushing to lift the hat, the faded scarf, the broken stick of an arm. To them it was like watching a story end too soon, but the villagers gathered, and as they stood around the fallen figure, no one spoke of it as lost. Instead, they remembered how it had endured the storm, how it had worn their garlands and gifts, how it had watched over games, harvests, and feasts. The Scarecrow, lying in pieces on the earth it had guarded, seemed more alive in memory than it had ever been in straw. The farmer bent, brushed the dust from its hat, and said softly, "It has stood long enough." And so the Scarecrow's fall was not an end, but the beginning of its next chapter, a story carried in the voices of all who had known it. That night, under the same moon that once crowned it in garlands, the village slept with a strange comfort, for though the field was empty, their guardian had not truly gone, it had simply lain down to rest. The remembrance. The Scarecrow lay quiet in the field, no longer upright, yet not forgotten. Days passed, and the villagers felt its absence each time they glanced across the furrows. Where once a crooked silhouette had greeted them against sky and season, now there was only open air. So they gathered as villages, do not out of duty, but out of affection. The children brought wildflowers, laying them where the Scarecrow had stood. The baker brought a round loaf golden as the sun. The smith placed a bent nail, saying it was the strongest gift he could spare. Each offering was small, but together they became something larger, a remembrance. Around the Scarecrow's resting place, the villagers shared stories. One remembered how it had worn a garland at the festival. Another swore it had leaned protectively during the storm. The children claimed it smiled at them when no one else was looking. The farmer listened, his weathered hands folded, and realized that the scarecrow had sown more than protection, it had sown belonging. What had begun as woodcloth and straw had grown into something carried in every heart. That evening, as the sun sank low, they set a lantern upon the ground where the scarecrow had stood. Its glow was soft, fragile, yet enough. The fields seemed less empty in that light, and so remembrance became ritual. Each season, when sowing or harvest came, a lantern would be lit, a loaf shared, and a story told. The scarecrow did not rise again, but in memory it stood taller than before. The rebirth spring returned once more, soft and green as it always does. The field was tilled, seeds scattered, and the earth warmed beneath the sun. Yet something was missing. The farmer paused often at the place where the scarecrow had stood, as though waiting for a silent companion who no longer answered. One morning, while mending his tools, the farmer looked at the bundle of remnants he had carefully saved: a hat frayed by sun, a stick bent by years of standing, scraps of cloth faded but familiar. They were too worn to rebuild, yet too precious to discard. So he began slowly and thoughtfully to weave them into new shapes. The old hat he patched and pressed into a sling for carrying seed. The wooden pole he cut and set as a marker at the edge of his field. The scraps of cloth he stitched into a small pouch in which he carried grain, and the straw he scattered it gently into the soil, letting it mingle with the earth that once it had guarded. The scarecrow did not rise again yet. In these quiet transformations, it lived differently. It became tool helper, companion to the field once more, though in humbler ways. The children noticed. They said the seed pouch held luck, the marker post stood like a guardian, and the soil grew kinder where the straw had mixed. The farmer smiled, for he knew what they did not, that the scarecrow had never truly gone. In each furrow sown, in each harvest gathered, there was a thread of its spirit woven into the life of the land. What once had stood against crows now stood within memory, work, and soil, and in this way the scarecrow was reborn, not in form, but in presence. The legacy: years passed as years will. The field ripened and emptied in its patient rhythm. The farmer grew slower in his steps, and children who once garlanded the scarecrow's shoulders now carried their own baskets of grain. Yet the story of the scarecrow endured. Around fires in winter, villagers told of the guardian who had stood against storms, who had worn garlands, who had been dressed in scarves and blessed at festivals. Some swore it had once moved when the wind blew, others that it had whispered warnings to crows. The children listened wide-eyed, though they had never seen the scarecrow themselves. To them it was half truth, half legend, a figure of patience and strength stitched from straw and memory. They carried the tale forward so that the scarecrow stood taller in their imagination than it ever had in the field. The farmer, now older, would sit at the edge of his land, resting on the marker post he had made from its wooden spine. He would smile as he listened, never correcting the stories, never insisting on what was true, for he knew that truth lived not in straw or sticks, but in what remained with people when the figure was gone. The scarecrow had given its watch to the fields, then its pieces to the soil, and at last its story to the village. And stories, unlike straw, do not rot, they endure. So though the scarecrow no longer stood, it was never lost. It lived on in laughter, in memory, in whispered tales under harvest moons, and in that way it remained what it had always been: a quiet guardian. The field swayed gently in the evening wind, and if one listened closely, it almost seemed to sigh.